Lovely. Thank you. Then I get a applause at least once today. Let's see when I'm done, because I actually decided to go a little bit rogue on the topic. So I will cover noise exposure and also um, different noise exposures, because we know that the leisure noise going to rock concerts that can damage your hearing, but there are also occupational noise. And what when others that we found was that public transport has these consequences again. Also, it can create noise-induced hearing loss. But the more that I sort of got into the topic of this meeting, I sort of began to speculate a little bit more, and got some inspiration. Usually we think about noise exposure and hearing loss as something that happens really long time after. It's like getting sunburn. You can develop skin cancer many years after. You go to loud concerts, and you can develop a hearing loss many years after. And for many years, that was what perhaps what people thought about as sound and health. That was you can get a hearing loss if you're exposed to too much sound. But what we have seen over the last couple of years is also more some short-term or instantaneous reactions or consequences of noise. So of course there's tinnitus. We all knew that if you go to a rock concert, you can have tinnitus the next day. There's also the joy that you had of being at the concert. If we just switching gears a little bit, short-term noise exposure. So that is actually if you have traffic noise around where you live, then within a couple of months that can actually affect your health and lead to cardiovascular problems. If you're interested in that kind of things, look at what happened in Munich when they moved the airport from one part of the city to another part of the city. They could actually see health issues moving within 6 months. Really scary stuff. And then the other long-term consequences of being exposed to sound. And again, you can both see it in the negative way, that you can get a noise-induced hearing loss, but there's also the thing that being exposed to noise, to sound, is also has some cognitive benefits, because we need to have access to sound. So it's a trade-off. We need a lot of sound, but not too much. And we need a lot of sound to feel good, but not too much, because that can have a health consequence. And then in the end, I have a little bonus for you, where we can perhaps begin, instead of having this negative sort of dimension or angle to this, also talk about what if you could measure benefits directly to music. So the starting point was actually that some years ago we had a project funded by the European Union on big data supporting public health policies. And one of the things that we looked into was that if you have a hearing aid that you wear continuously and continuously log the noise levels that you are exposed to, can you then predict the temporary threshold shift, so the short-term increased hearing thresholds that you might have? Can you make such a module? Can you see what that leads to? And we had also wanted to then measure people's audiograms along the way, but that was clinically infeasible, so we never got to do that. But we still had models where we integrated the sound levels that people were exposed to on a daily basis, and then we could predict if that would cause a temporary threshold shift. So this is this kind of data where you have a hearing aid that people wear. They have a smartphone that is also connected to it, and the hearing aid sends 21 parameters. So that's the signal to noise level and the sound pressure level and the noise floor. And it sent this once every minute. And this is just like the other presenter. This is in order to ensure that nobody can decode who said what was said. So it's for privacy. So it was simply just access to these single estimates and not the actual audio. So no privacy in privacy was preserved. So this was the setup. This was the data that we had, and then I can give a few examples. So one of the first things that we looked into was just to really compare, because it's just to make sure that we are doing all right. So here we are just comparing the sound environment classifier of the hearing aids in the sample that we collected in the erosion project at that point in time, and then we actually had another sample with some completely other users, completely other places in the world. It was just to eyeball that, okay, the patterns actually look a bit the same, so that the quiet condition is sort of, you are mostly in quiet conditions in the morning and late at night. There's this increase of speech situations throughout the day. You have speech and noise at a lower level, and then just noise at the lowest level. So that's, some people would say, these are the situations that people with hearing aids that they avoid because they do not want to be in so noisy environments. But we can just see that it's some of the same patterns that we see in those groups, and that's a good start. But let's go into to noise exposure. So concerts. Basically, this was me going to Guns N' Roses in Copenhagen some years ago, and I was really at the back, and I had and then I wore hearing aids, and I had replaced the domes with the hearing protectors. So I was sitting there with the hearing protectors in, so I did not get this hearing loss that I can predict that people can get here. And then you could see, okay, yeah, but if I had not worn hearing protectors, I might have had a 12 dB hearing loss the next morning, and then it would gradually disappear over the next couple of days. And if I had been in front of the scene, it would probably have been way louder, and I would probably had a bigger hearing loss and more tinnitus the next day, just like when I went to Metallica in 1992. Third row. So basically, this is what we all know. If you do this, if you're really living on the edge and going to rock concerts, you will be exposed to noise that can damage your hearing. You can feel it the next day, and you can perhaps you can also feel it in the years to come. But I think that's a fairly unbalanced way at looking at where you can actually be exposed to noise, because we know rock concerts are loud. We know there's also occupational noise problems where you are exposed to too much noise there. But what we realized while we were doing this project, with the help of Dave and his team at EVE.io in London, was that actually public transport is really loud too. And interesting, one of the loudest segments of the London Tube is actually right under the Ear Institute of UCL London. Well, I don't know if it's coincidental or what, but that's where it is. That's the northern line, the black line. You can then if you go to Eve, you can look into this. But they simply traveled all the tube lines and recorded the noise levels. And what we could see when we looked at that had some pretty high noise levels too. So of course it's not as bad as going to a full rock concert, but this is perhaps something that you do every day. So at least I do not go to rock concerts every day. It's 2 or 3 times a year. But if you are on this tube line, you go there more or less every day. Perhaps you will be saved by COVID, so that you're only going there 3 times a week nowadays. But generally, this is something that you're exposed to every day. So it's really about understanding that if you want to look into noise exposure and noise-induced hearing loss, we have to look at people's full life. it's not just enough to zoom in on how much you're exposed to noise when you go to concert, to a club. It's also how much noise are you exposed to when you are at home, when you are in public transport, and when you are at work. So, and in order to do so, you have to use some measurement equipment that you actually wear more or less all the time, which is why hearing aids are actually quite good for that, because these are devices that people keep in their ears for the whole day. It's not like when we use small headsets. At least I tend to take them in and out, so they would not be able to measure the noise exposure that I have every day. And if you look at it from a public health perspective, perhaps you will say that, but why you cannot measure everybody's noise exposure like this, because you are not putting these devices on young people, for instance. But if you use some of the data that you have there and also some scrambled location, you can actually build models of how loud different parts of cities and environments are, and then you can begin to make predictions about that. So that was the kind of story that I set out to tell you about when we wrote the abstract. So here comes the little bonus, because we have done some studies where we have actually had the hearing aids and also a smartwatch connected to the same smartphone. And then with this, we could actually access the data that describes the sound environment, but also people's pulse, so their heart rate. And this busy graph here shows the heart rate as color-coded as green for a low heart rate, which is associated with a low stress, and then the redder it gets, the higher the heart rate, the higher the stress. And you can see that if you have a low level, there's really not any influence by the signal-to-noise ratio. But once we begin to come over the mid-level, and this is from around 60-65 dBs, above that, we actually see an interaction between the sound pressure level, the signal-to-noise ratio, and the pulse. So basically, your body responds quite quickly. Within a few minutes, it responds with a higher pulse if you are in 75 dB noise than 75 dB speech, at least when we see it, measure it with our hearing aids. So what I'm then thinking about is that we have something here that allows us to disambiguate the level of the sound, but also perhaps something around the pleasantness of the sound that you're in, or at least how much you are stressed by it. So the other presenter that talks about one man's noise, the other man's music, perhaps we can actually use pulse and sound data to measure that. And then we can look into whether loud music is less stressful than noise. You know, I don't know if you see it here, but other parts in the world, you see that a lot of students actually write their assignments while listening to heavy metal in the headsets. So perhaps something about that. And also, can we actually use this to measure when music is music or when music is noise? So can we measure that you are actually having a negative health impact by the music that comes from a bar close to you, but when you're listening to yourself, it's not having these kinds of effects. So I think that perhaps combining audio and something as low level as wristbands like this can actually lead to some quite interesting work in this community, and really also tie music and hearing and health together in a slightly longer perspective than we usually see. No worries. Because basically that is the whole essence of my talk. So we started out by talking a little bit about the different kinds of noises that you are exposed to, and that if we want to look at the health implications of noise, there is the leisure noise, but there's also the occupational noise and the public transport. As a little bonus, I can actually say that in some of the data we have collected, we have seen that the people that report that they have a noise-induced hearing loss due to leisure noise, they still seem to be in louder environments than their counterparts. Once rock and roll, always rock and roll. That's the way I put it. Then we can talk about the time horizon. I will not repeat that. And then I think the take-home message for me, and this is not for you, but for me from this meeting, is that there's actually some more things that we could do if we integrate these different measures and have this full day overview of how people are exposed to sound. And with that, thank you for attending, and thank you, Kai, for inviting me.